For cinephiles, Apocalypse Now means different things to different people. The ultimate war epic, a humorous parody, a disturbing reflection on the violence in our species, a case study in cinema that comes in wildly over budget. One might be forgiven for believing that its source material, Joseph Conrad's novel Heart of Darkness, might be easier to interpret simply for being a work written by one person and for which budget, lighting, set pieces, actors' salaries and lots of pyrotechnics were no concern. But one would also be mistaken. Heart of Darkness is, more so than some of the densest literary works, often impenetrable. Defining theme, philosophy, and sometimes even the tone of the work proves after more than 100 years to be difficult when much of the work's meaning remains enigmatic and open to interpretation. No less, the novel is a direct and in many ways indispensable lexicon of what brought Apocalypse Now into being. In this video, I'm going to dissect and identify the key similarities and differences between the lauded literary work and the modern adaptation that director Francis Ford Coppola almost threw himself into ruin to make. Here, we identify three key themes that tie the works together in such a way that the latter is identifiably an adaptation of the former. These are Western imperialism and native displacement, the nature of evil, and most importantly, how that evil is inherent in the hearts of everyone. First, let's talk about imperialism. I would typically use something as reputable as Merriam-Webster or Dictionary.com for a definition here, but for our purposes, Google's dictionary actually has a balance of simplicity and relevance that is difficult to resist. A policy of extending a country's power and influence through colonization, use of military force, or other means. The definition is fitting because it actually addresses both angles of imperialism found in the respective works. In Heart of Darkness, the protagonist, Marlowe, is charged with travelling up the Congo River to retrieve a company man named Kurtz, and being set in Africa in the late 19th century, it centres heavily on colonization. In Apocalypse Now, however, Benjamin Willard is charged with travelling up the fictional Nung River at the height of the Vietnam War, to find and eliminate a rogue colonel who is also named Kurtz. In the adaptation, the concept of imperialism is far more prevalent in the form of our definition's latter example, that of military force. In Heart of Darkness, the imperial or invading entity is the ivory company for which Marlowe works and all those who work under its capitalistic employ. In the film, that evading entity is instead the United States military. So, to answer how imperialism is really different between the book and the film is relatively simple. In the novel, imperialism takes its most basic form, the taking of valued resources and leaving little behind. In the adaptation, it is arguably far more insidious, because of the sense of displacement in America's role in the war. The war is depicted in the film not merely as a war of blood, bombs and bullets, but a cultural war. A war that would see communism in Southeast Asia replaced in its own image. This is a commentary on capitalism's pervasive and displacing nature that, as a concept, is far more modern than the 19th century novel would have been able to express. And one can be certain in saying at least that in this, Coppola did not wish to be ambiguous. Both the novel and the film address the concept of evil in such a way that the perception of it changes over time. Both suggest that nothing can be immutably labelled as evil, that evil is subjective and in a beholder's ever-changing eyes. In the novel, the Ivory Company presents itself as something of a humane entity, bringing light to Africa when, in truth, they do not stand for philanthropy or even really to bring Kurtz back alive for supposed altruistic means. They are there, of course, for the ivory, which the mysterious Kurtz is so amply able to supply them with. An extension of the company, the evil in Kurtz is his corruption, bending the will of natives, which once again links us back to imperialism and displacement, to meet his lust for ivory. His avarice and his will to dominate are, in the book, the embodiment of his Heart of Darkness. In the film, we can argue easily that the US military is decidedly more evil than the comparable Ivory Company because, while the Ivory Company takes what it pleases of the Free State's natural resources, Uncle Sam is there not to take, but to eviscerate, by means of a bullet, napalm, or Agent Orange. Colonel Kurtz is also decidedly more evil, because his corruption of the Montagnards leads him not merely to rapacious greed, but to war crime and murder. His escalating brutality becomes more than even the American military can warrant, and for, as it's implied, entirely selfish fears, he is accused of the murder of 4 Vietnamese double agents. What does he do? Does he flee the country or turn himself in? No. He marches on, growing ever madder by the day, until he sets up a compound in the Angkor region of Cambodia and the Montagnards treat him like a god. Kurtz in the novel is evil because he exploits indigenous peoples and the Congo's resources. Kurtz in the film is evil because in attempting to complete his mission, he executes his own brand of warfare against the Viet Cong, not one sanctioned or endorsed by the military that bore him. The argument could well be made here that Colonel Kurtz is more sympathetic as a character because, though novel Kurtz is corrupted by material gain, the Colonel is simply escalating the nature of his orders, that being to eliminate the VC. The real evil, then, is the United States military, the machine that first loosed him upon their enemy. One particular anecdote to Willard toward the end of the film is harrowing and very much absent from the book. Kurtz retells how, after doing humanitarian work in a local village, inoculating the children there from disease, the men of the village who misunderstood their intent severed every injected arm, and when Kurtz returned to see for himself, quote, "They were in a pile of little arms. And I thought, my God, the genius of that. These men who fought with their hearts, who had families, who had children, who were filled with love, but they had the strength to do that." Kurtz becomes convinced that this conviction is what the US military lacks, which is in effect a call for his side, as it were, to eschew civilized warfare. It is a call by Kurtz for the invasive force to return to a baser self, and thus complete its mission there. It is a call to return to the evil inherent. Both Marlowe and Willard in the novel and film respectively are at the outset morally ambiguous. Neither is presented as the moral compass many protagonists tend to become, and this is with good reason. When novel Kurtz first entered the Congo, he was much like Marlowe, arriving with purpose, and known among peers to be level-headed, charismatic, and even honourable. And as Marlowe proceeds on to the inner station where he intends to find Kurtz, the deeper into the Congo he goes, the more dense and oppressive the jungle becomes. When he finds Kurtz, the company man has established himself as a god among the natives and has raided surrounding territory in search of more ivory. What's pertinent in the book's depiction is the collection of severed heads adorning the posts around the station, making his methods in those raids abundantly clear. The evil inherent in Kurtz has manifested itself over time in his exposure to the jungle, in exposure namely to corruption in exploiting the natives. The evil inherent in Marlowe, however, is more subtle. His own exposure to the Congo is nowhere near approaching that of Kurtz, and yet, in one part of recounting his story, Marlowe observes native Africans dancing upon a shore and wonders why he might not go to them, quote, "for a howl and a dance." The temptations over time, the same temptations that brought Kurtz into a more primitive state, do touch upon Marlowe's character. But it is in Apocalypse Now that US Marlowe insert Willard has far more overt temptations of heart. Colonel Kurtz is, on reflection, dutifully similar to Kurtz in the novel, perhaps why Coppola retained his name and added only his military status, which is significant to us in the sense that one of the biggest differences between novel and film is that the imperialistic force in the novel, the Ivory Company, is not nearly so much at the forefront of the plot as the setting of the Vietnam War is in the film. Where Marlowe's journey into his, quote, inner self, as it were, is reflected in the primitive and ancient jungles of the Congo, Willard's journey is fraught with the literal threat of death in war. Whether to murder for more ivory or murder more Viet Cong for his country, if it really is for his country, when in the throes of his madness, the descent of Kurtz into evil is on both sides of the coin, absolute. It feels appropriate that Coppola renamed our Marlowe insert in the film because, in Willard's case, the journey into his own heart of darkness is much more explicit. Killing a Vietnamese peasant on the sampan to preserve his mission's priority, which is polarized in relation to Marlowe's in the book. Though Marlowe is to bring Kurtz back via the riverboat, Willard's mission is to kill the Colonel. A mission which he succeeds. When he does so, one would think that the Montagnards that had followed Kurtz's every lead, had worshipped him as a god, would turn on Willard. But instead they do something very curious and something very absent from the book. They acknowledge the deed. Willard has, in a symbolic sense, taken on Kurtz's dark heart, indeed may have chosen to continue on his work, but chooses not to. He slips away, back down the Nung, and though the story ends here, we as the viewer know that the Vietnam War rages on.